He thought embarrassing her would earn him laughs, but he had no idea that in less than 10 seconds, the entire hallway would turn against him in silence. The late afternoon sun stretched long shadows across Jefferson High's main corridor, where rows of metal lockers reflected flickers of movement and noise. The usual chaos of students packing up, laughing too loudly, shoving books into backpacks like the day couldn't end fast enough. And right in the middle of it all stood Emily Carter, quiet as always, her presence barely noticeable unless you were looking for her, which most people weren't. Her soft gray sweater slightly oversized, sleeves pulled just past her wrists, her gaze lowered not out of fear but out of habit, as if she had long ago learned that invisibility was safer than attention, and for weeks, maybe months, that strategy had worked, until today, until Jason Miller decided she was the perfect target. Jason leaned casually against a locker just a few feet away, surrounded by a small circle of friends who fed off his energy, the kind of group that laughed a little too quickly at everything he said, not because it was funny, but because it was him, his varsity jacket hanging open, his confidence loud without needing volume. And when his eyes landed on Emily, something shifted, not curiosity, not interest, just opportunity, the kind that comes from knowing no one would step in, not here, not in this hallway, not when it was him. "Hey," Jason called out, his voice cutting through the chatter like it had permission to interrupt everything else. "You always this quiet? Or is today special?" A few heads turned, not fully invested, just enough to catch the beginning of something, and Emily paused, her fingers tightening slightly around the strap of her backpack, but she didn't respond, didn't look up, didn't give him anything, and for a moment, that silence only encouraged him. "Come on," he added, pushing off the locker and taking a step closer. "I'm talking to you." The circle tightened, the air shifting from casual to expectant, and somewhere nearby, a locker slammed shut, echoing just a little too loud, as if the building itself was reacting. Emily slowly lifted her eyes, not sharply, not dramatically, just enough to acknowledge his presence, and there was something in that look, something steady, something unreadable, but Jason didn't notice, or maybe he didn't care. "You don't say much, do you?" he smirked, glancing back at his friends, waiting for the easy laugh, and they gave it to him, right on cue, the kind of laughter that filled space but said nothing, and still, Emily didn't answer, her silence now heavier, more deliberate, like it wasn't emptiness but restraint. A few students nearby lingered longer than they should have, sensing the tension building in small, quiet increments, like pressure before a storm no one wanted to name, and Jason stepped even closer, just enough to invade her space, just enough to make it clear that this wasn't casual anymore, that this was intentional. "You know," he said, lowering his voice slightly, "people who don't talk usually have something to hide." The words hung there, not sharp enough to cut, but heavy enough to press down on the moment, and somewhere in the background, a laugh started but didn't quite finish, like even his audience wasn't fully sure where this was going anymore. Emily's posture didn't change, but something else did, something subtle, something internal, the kind of shift that doesn't announce itself, but once it happens, everything after feels different, and for the first time, she didn't look away, her eyes meeting his directly, calm, steady, almost certain. Jason hesitated for just a fraction of a second, barely noticeable, but it was there, a flicker of something he couldn't quite place, and instead of stepping back, he leaned in just a little more, doubling down, because backing off wasn't who he was, not here, not in front of everyone. "Or maybe," he added, trying to regain control of the moment, "you just don't know what to say." The hallway seemed to narrow around them, sounds dulling at the edges, conversations fading into background noise, and for a brief, almost imperceptible second, everything slowed, as if the world itself was waiting to see what would happen next, and Jason, still confident, still certain he owned this moment, had no idea that he had already crossed a line he couldn't see, a line that would change everything in the next 10 seconds, a line that would turn laughter into silence, and confidence into something he would wish he could take back. The words did not echo, they did not need to, because the calm certainty in Emily's voice carried further than any shout could have, settling into the space between them like something solid, something real, and for a second longer than anyone expected, Jason just stood there, his expression caught between amusement, and something else he did not want to recognize, because people like him were not used to being told where a line was, especially not by someone he had already decided did not matter. A faint chuckle broke from one of his friends, uncertain, almost forced, as if trying to restart the scene, to pull it back into something familiar. "Did she just tell you what to do?" the boy muttered. But even that comment did not land the way it should have, not with the same easy confidence as before, because the energy had shifted in a way no one could quite explain. Jason exhaled through his nose, shaking his head slightly, as if brushing off the moment. "Or what?" he replied, his tone returning to something sharper, something more defensive than playful now, and he leaned in just enough to reassert himself, though there was a subtle hesitation in the movement, a fraction of a second where he seemed to reconsider, but pride did not allow retreat. Not here, not now, not in front of everyone watching. Emily did not step back, did not flinch, and that stillness was louder than any reaction could have been, her eyes steady, her posture unchanged, as if she had already anticipated this exact response, as if this moment had already played out somewhere in her mind long before it happened in reality. And that quiet preparedness began to ripple outward, reaching the students who were now watching more closely, more intently. No longer just spectators, but witnesses to something that was no longer entertainment. Somewhere down the hallway, a teacher's voice called out faintly, but it did not reach them, not really, because the focus here had narrowed completely, the world shrinking to the few feet between Jason and Emily. And in that space, every detail seemed sharper. The scuff marks on the floor, the faint hum of fluorescent lights, the sound of someone shifting their weight just behind the circle. Jason glanced briefly to the side, catching the eyes of a few classmates who were no longer laughing, their expressions uncertain, questioning, and that hesitation fed something uncomfortable in him, something he tried to push down quickly, because losing control of a moment like this was not something he knew how to handle. "You think you can just stand there and act like you are not scared?" he said, his voice rising slightly, trying to force a reaction, trying to bring back the version of Emily that fit his expectations. But the more he spoke, the clearer it became that she was not going to give him what he wanted, and that realization, slow and unwelcome, began to chip away at his confidence. Emily's fingers relaxed at her side, her shoulders settling even more, and there was a quiet shift in her stance, subtle yet precise, the kind of movement that might go unnoticed by most, but not by those who were paying attention now, and a few were, their curiosity growing as the tension built not through noise, but through restraint. "I already told you," she said, her voice still even, still controlled. "You should stop." And there was no anger in it, no challenge, just a statement, clear and grounded, and that made it harder to dismiss, harder to laugh off, because it did not invite argument, it simply existed. Jason opened his mouth again, ready to respond, ready to push further, but something in the way she stood there, unshaken, unbothered, made the words hesitate on his tongue, and in that hesitation, the silence deepened, stretching just long enough for doubt to slip in, thin but undeniable. The students around them shifted again, some leaning in, others pulling back slightly, as if sensing that whatever came next would not be easily undone, and Jason, still standing in front of her, felt that pressure building, not from her, but from the absence of the reaction he expected, the absence of fear, the absence of submission, and that absence was beginning to speak louder than anything he could say. He straightened slightly, forcing a smirk back onto his face, but it did not sit the same way it had before, it did not carry the same weight, because the moment had already begun to move beyond him, beyond his control, and though he did not fully understand it yet, he was already standing at the edge of a mistake he could not take back, a moment that would unfold faster than he could react, leaving him not as the center of attention, but as the lesson everyone would remember. Jason felt it before anyone else could name it. That subtle shift where confidence no longer felt like control, but like something fragile, something he had to hold together manually. And the longer the silence stretched, the more effort it took to maintain the version of himself that everyone expected to see. The version that never hesitated, never questioned, never lost ground. Yet here he was, standing across from someone who was not playing along, someone who was not reacting the way the script demanded. and that alone made the moment unpredictable in a way that unsettled him more than he would ever admit. A few students at the edge of the gathering began to step back slightly, not out of fear, but out of instinct, as if giving space to something they could not yet understand but knew was about to happen, and the hallway, once loud and chaotic, had narrowed into a quiet corridor of attention, every eye fixed on the space between them, every breath held just a fraction longer than usual. Jason shifted his weight, rolling his shoulders as if to reset himself, to shake off the hesitation that had crept in, and he forced a laugh again, though this one lacked the ease of the others. "You are serious right now," he said, glancing briefly at his friends, searching for reinforcement, for the laughter that would restore balance. But it came slower this time, thinner, uncertain, and that hesitation echoed back at him louder than any response could have. Emily remained exactly where she was, her stance unchanged, her expression calm, and there was something about that calmness that did not invite confrontation. It simply existed, steady and grounded, like a line drawn quietly but firmly, and for the first time, Jason seemed to recognize that pushing past it might not go the way he expected. "You think telling me to stop means anything?" he pressed, though his voice carried a slight edge now. Not just confidence, but something sharper, something defensive, and he stepped closer again, narrowing the distance to almost nothing, as if proximity alone could re-establish control. But even that felt different this time, because Emily did not move, did not retreat, and that lack of reaction created a space where his usual tactics had nowhere to land. A girl standing nearby whispered softly to her friend, "Something is off," and though the words were quiet, they seemed to ripple outward, because others were thinking the same thing, feeling the same tension that had shifted from entertainment to anticipation, from laughter to stillness. Jason lifted his hand slightly, not aggressively, not dramatically, just enough to emphasize his presence, to underline his words. But even that small motion seemed to hang in the air longer than it should have, as if time itself had slowed, stretching the moment into something more significant than either of them had planned. Emily's eyes followed the movement, not sharply, not reactively, just with awareness. And in that awareness was something unmistakable, readiness, not the kind that came from fear, but the kind that came from experience, from knowing exactly where the moment could go and being prepared for it without needing to announce it. The fluorescent lights above hummed faintly, a constant, steady sound that filled the silence between breaths. And somewhere at the far end of the hallway, a door opened and closed, the noise distant, irrelevant, because everything that mattered was happening here, in this narrow space where assumptions were beginning to break apart. Jason's smirk returned, but it did not reach his eyes this time. "Go ahead," he said, his tone almost challenging, though the confidence behind it had thinned. "What are you going to do?" And that question, meant to assert dominance, instead revealed something else, uncertainty, because for the first time, he did not already know the answer. Emily inhaled slowly, a measured breath that seemed to anchor her even more firmly in place. And then she shifted, just slightly, a movement so controlled and precise that it drew attention not because it was dramatic, but because it was intentional, every part of it purposeful. And in that small adjustment, something became clear to anyone paying close enough attention. This was not improvisation. This was not reaction. This was preparation meeting opportunity. The hallway grew quieter still, if that was even possible, the kind of silence that presses against your ears, that makes even the smallest sound feel amplified. And in that silence, the balance of the moment tipped, almost imperceptibly at first, then undeniably, as the control Jason had assumed was his began to slip away, not through force, not through confrontation, but through something far more unsettling. The realization that he had misjudged the situation entirely, and that realization, once it took hold, would not leave him enough time to recover before everything changed. The moment stretched just long enough to become undeniable, and in that stretched silence, something invisible but powerful shifted completely, not in volume, not in movement, but in control, and Jason felt it slipping through his fingers like something he could not quite grasp anymore, because the reaction he had been waiting for never came, and without that reaction, without fear, without hesitation, his words had nowhere to land, nowhere to take root, and that absence began to turn the spotlight back onto him in a way he had never experienced before. Emily's slight adjustment and stance settled fully now, her feet planted with quiet certainty, her shoulders aligned in a way that suggested balance rather than tension, and though most students could not explain what they were seeing, they could feel it, that subtle sense that she was no longer the one being cornered, that something deeper had surfaced, something that did not need to be announced because it was already present. Jason's hand, still partially raised from his earlier gesture, hovered, for a fraction of a second longer than it should have, as if his body had lost sync with his usual rhythm, and in that brief pause, his confidence faltered just enough to be noticed, not loudly, not dramatically, but enough for the watching eyes around them to register that something was off. A boy near the lockers shifted uncomfortably, glancing at his friend, who no longer smiled but simply watched, his expression tightening with curiosity, and across the circle, someone let out a breath they did not realize they had been holding, the sound soft but sharp in the quiet. Jason cleared his throat, forcing himself forward verbally. "You are not going to do anything," he said, the statement more hopeful than certain now, as if saying it out loud might make it true. But even as the words left his mouth, they lacked weight, they lacked conviction, because the moment had already begun to move beyond what he could define. Emily did not respond immediately, and that delay, that deliberate pause, carried more power than any quick answer could have, because it gave space for the realization to settle, for the tension to build, for the audience to feel the imbalance growing. And when she finally moved again, it was with the same controlled precision, a small step, a subtle repositioning, nothing aggressive, nothing rushed, yet unmistakably intentional, like someone who understood exactly where they stood and exactly what came next. The fluorescent lights above flickered faintly, casting brief shadows that shifted across their faces, and in that flicker, Jason's expression revealed something he could no longer fully hide: uncertainty, thin but real, threading through the confidence he tried to maintain, and for the first time, he hesitated not because he chose to, but because he did not know how to proceed. "Last chance," Emily said quietly, her voice steady, not raised, not sharpened, just clear, and the simplicity of those two words landed with a weight that seemed disproportionate to their volume, because they did not challenge him, they informed him, and that distinction made all the difference. The students around them leaned in slightly, not physically, but in attention, every sense tuned to what was unfolding. And even those who had been laughing minutes ago now stood still, their expressions shifting from amusement to anticipation, because the narrative had changed, and they could feel it even if they could not articulate it. Jason forced a smile again, though it faltered at the edges. "Or what?" he repeated, but this time the question did not sound like a challenge. It sounded like uncertainty dressed as confidence, and that difference echoed louder than anything else in the hallway. Emily's gaze did not waver, her posture unchanged, her presence steady, and then, without warning, without build-up, without any dramatic signal, the moment tipped, not through force, not through noise, but through action so precise and controlled that it unfolded almost faster than the eye could follow. A shift in space, a redirection of momentum, a simple yet undeniable demonstration of awareness and control that left Jason no room to respond the way he expected. His movement halted, his balance interrupted not by aggression but by timing, by positioning, by the kind of quiet skill that does not announce itself until it is already complete. The hallway fell completely silent, not gradually, not partially, but all at once, as if every sound had been cut off at the source. And in that silence, Jason stood frozen, his expression caught mid-reaction, his confidence stripped not by humiliation, but by realization, the sudden, unavoidable understanding that he had misread everything, that the person he had chosen to target was never what he assumed, and that the moment he had tried to control had already turned into something he could not undo, not in 10 seconds, not ever, because some lessons, once revealed, do not fade. They settle into memory, sharp and permanent, leaving behind a truth that no amount of laughter could erase. For a long second that felt stretched beyond time itself, Jason did not move, his body caught in a position that no longer made sense now that the moment had passed him, his expression frozen between disbelief and realization, and the silence around him was not empty. It was heavy, pressing down on every student. who had witnessed what just happened, because they had all expected something loud, something chaotic, something easy to understand, but instead they saw something controlled, something precise, something that did not need force to be undeniable, and that difference changed everything. A backpack slipped from someone's shoulder and hit the floor with a dull thud that echoed far louder than it should have, snapping a few heads slightly. But no one spoke, no one laughed, because the atmosphere had shifted completely, and laughter no longer belonged here, not after what they had just seen. Jason blinked once, then again, as if trying to catch up to the moment, to rewind it in his mind and find the point where he could have stopped it, avoided it, undone it. But there was no such point anymore, because the realization had already settled in, clear and unavoidable, that the situation he had tried to control had slipped beyond him in the span of seconds, leaving him standing not as the one in charge, but as the one exposed. His friends, who had once stood close, now lingered just a little farther back, their body language shifting in ways they did not consciously choose, their confidence no longer aligned with his, because association felt different now, uncertain, and even they did not know how to react to what they had witnessed. One of them cleared his throat softly, as if to say something, then stopped, the words dissolving before they formed, because nothing seemed appropriate in a moment like this. Emily stepped back just half a pace, not retreating, not disengaging, but simply creating space, her movements calm, controlled, as if the moment had ended for her the instant it began, as if she had already moved on while everyone else was still trying to process it, and her expression remained unchanged, no satisfaction, no anger, no need to prove anything further, because what needed to be understood had already been made clear without a single raised voice. Jason shifted his weight awkwardly, his shoulders no longer squared with the same certainty, and he glanced around briefly, searching for something familiar, something that would restore the balance he was used to. But all he found were eyes, watching, not laughing, not mocking, just observing, and that was worse, because silence leaves no place to hide. "I did not," he started, his voice lower now, lacking the projection it once carried, and he stopped mid-sentence, the words failing to come together, because there was nothing he could say that would reshape what had already happened, nothing that would return the moment to the version he had expected. Emily looked at him for a brief second longer, her gaze steady but not confrontational, and in that brief exchange, something passed between them, not a challenge, not a threat, just a quiet acknowledgement that the line had been crossed and the outcome had followed, exactly as it had to, and then she shifted her attention away, as if the moment no longer required her presence. The hallway slowly began to breathe again, a faint murmur rising at the edges, not loud, not immediate, but gradual, like sound returning after being held back, and with it came whispers, quiet observations, subtle shifts in perception that would carry far beyond this moment. Because what they had seen was not just an interaction, it was a reversal, a quiet dismantling of assumptions that had gone unchallenged for too long. Jason remained where he was for another second, then another, his posture adjusting slightly as if trying to recover some version of himself. But the certainty was gone, replaced by something unfamiliar, something reflective, and though he would not admit it out loud, not here, not in front of everyone, the realization had already taken hold, firm and unshakable, that the person he had underestimated had never been what she appeared to be, and that some mistakes, once made, do not need punishment to be understood, because the lesson reveals itself in the silence that follows. The hallway did not return to normal all at once. It unfolded slowly, like a scene that refused to reset because something too real had just happened, something that could not be brushed aside with a laugh or a quick distraction. And as the murmurs began to rise again, they carried a different tone, quieter, more thoughtful, as if every student present was recalibrating what they thought they understood about strength, about presence, about who truly held control in a moment like that. Jason finally moved, just a small shift at first, adjusting his stance as if trying to re-anchor himself in a space that no longer felt familiar, and though he attempted to straighten his shoulders, to reclaim some version of the confidence he had walked in with, it did not settle the same way. It felt forced, incomplete, like a role he was no longer fully able to play. His eyes flickered briefly toward his friends, but they were not looking at him the same way anymore, not with easy admiration or automatic agreement, but with something more complicated, something quieter, and that difference, subtle as it was, landed harder than any words could have. One of them shifted uncomfortably, rubbing the back of his neck, avoiding direct eye contact, while another glanced down the hallway, as if searching for an excuse to leave, and in that collective hesitation, the unspoken message became clear. The moment had changed how they saw him, even if none of them would say it out loud. Emily, meanwhile, had already begun to step away, her movements unhurried, unremarkable in appearance yet grounded in a calm that now felt unmistakable, and as she turned slightly, the soft fabric of her sweater catching the light, she blended back into the hallway in a way that seemed almost impossible considering what had just happened, as if she had never intended to stand out in the first place, as if everything she had done was simply a response to a situation that should not have existed at all. A girl near the lockers leaned toward her friend and whispered, "Did you see that?" Her voice barely audible, and her friend nodded slowly, eyes still fixed on Emily's retreating figure. "She did not even try to show off," the second girl replied, and that observation lingered in the air because it captured something essential, something that distinguished what had just happened from anything they had expected. Jason swallowed, the motion small but visible, and he glanced down briefly, as if grounding himself in something physical, something certain, but the certainty he was used to had already shifted, replaced by an awareness that he could not ignore. The awareness that the person he had chosen to challenge had never been an easy target, never been what she appeared to be, and that realization settled into him with a weight that did not need reinforcement. "It was nothing," he muttered under his breath, though the words lacked conviction, more an attempt to convince himself than anyone else. And even that attempt faded quickly as no one responded, no one laughed, no one echoed the dismissal, leaving the statement hanging awkwardly in the space around him. A locker slammed shut nearby, the sound sharp and sudden, breaking the tension just enough to remind everyone that time had not stopped, that classes would continue, that the day would move forward. But the moment itself would not disappear, it would stay, carried in quiet conversations, in glances, in the subtle shifts of how people saw each other from that point on. Emily reached the edge of the hallway, pausing briefly as she adjusted her backpack again, her movements as simple as they had always been, and for a second, she looked back, not directly at Jason, not searching for reaction, but simply observing the space she was leaving behind, and there was no triumph in her expression, no need to confirm what had already been understood, just a quiet composure that spoke louder than anything else could have. Jason remained where he was, the center of a space that no longer belonged to him, and though he would move eventually, would rejoin the flow of students, would attempt to return to normal, something had shifted beneath the surface, something that would not reset as easily as he might hope, because the lesson he had just experienced was not delivered through force or humiliation, but through clarity, and clarity, once seen, is not easily forgotten. The hallway continued to fill with sound again, footsteps, voices, the usual rhythm of a school day resuming. But beneath it all, there was a new awareness, subtle yet persistent, that the quiet girl no one had noticed before was no longer invisible, not because she demanded attention, but because she had shown, in the simplest and most undeniable way, that being underestimated is not the same as being weak, and that truth, once revealed, has a way of staying long after the moment itself has passed. By the time the final bell echoed faintly through the building, the story had already begun to spread, not loudly, not dramatically, but in quiet fragments carried from one student to another, whispered between classes, exchanged in glances and half-finished sentences, and with each retelling, something became clearer, not exaggerated, not distorted, but refined, like a moment being understood more deeply the further it traveled. In the cafeteria, a group of students leaned in closer than usual, their voices lowered. She did not even raise her voice, one of them said, still sounding surprised, and another shook his head slowly. He just stopped, like he did not know what to do. And that detail, repeated again and again, became the center of it all, not what she did, but how effortlessly everything shifted the moment she decided it would. Jason sat at the far end of a lunch table, his tray barely touched, his usual presence diminished in a way that was difficult to ignore. And though conversations continued around him, they no longer revolved around him, no longer sought his approval or reaction, and that absence, subtle but constant, pressed against him more than any confrontation could have. One of his friends attempted to lighten the mood, making a quick joke about something unrelated, but it fell flat, the timing off, the laughter delayed, and Jason forced a small smile that did not reach his eyes, because even he could feel that something fundamental had shifted, something that could not be undone with humor or distraction. Across the room, Emily sat alone as she always did, her lunch simple, her movements unremarkable, and if someone had not been there earlier, they would never guess that she had become the quiet center of attention without ever asking for it, without ever stepping into the spotlight intentionally, and that contrast only deepened the impact of what had happened, because she had not changed, not outwardly, not performatively. She had simply responded, and then returned to herself as if nothing extraordinary had occurred. A student passing by her table slowed for a second, as if considering saying something, then continued walking, unsure of what to say, because how do you speak to someone who just redefined everything you thought you understood without trying to impress anyone at all? Back in the hallway later that afternoon, the usual noise had returned, lockers slamming, voices rising and falling, but beneath it all, there was a difference, subtle yet present, in the way people moved around Emily, a slight awareness, a quiet respect that did not demand attention but existed nonetheless. And even those who had not witnessed the moment seemed to pick up on it instinctively, adjusting their tone, their distance, their assumptions without needing an explanation. Jason walked through that same hallway again, his pace steady but his awareness sharper now, and as he passed by groups of students, he caught fragments of conversation that stopped just a little too quickly, glances that lingered a second too long, and though no one openly confronted him, the absence of his usual influence was unmistakable, like a spotlight that had shifted without warning and would not return. He reached his locker and paused, his hand resting against the cool metal for a moment. And in that stillness, he replayed the moment again, not the beginning, not the words, but the instant everything changed, the instant he realized he was no longer in control. And no matter how many times he revisited it, the conclusion remained the same. He had misjudged her completely. Down the hall, Emily closed her locker quietly, the soft click barely audible, and as she turned to leave, her reflection lingered briefly in the metal surface, a simple image, unchanged, yet carrying something more now, something that could not be seen, but could be felt by anyone who paid attention. She walked past Jason without slowing, without acknowledging him directly, and in that passing moment, there was no tension, no unfinished conflict, just a quiet finality, as if the lesson had already been delivered and required no repetition. Jason watched her go for a second, then looked away, his expression unreadable, because what he felt was not something he could easily define, not embarrassment alone, not frustration, but understanding, the kind that settles slowly but firmly, the kind that changes how you see things whether you want it to or not. And as the hallway filled again with the rhythm of another school day moving forward, one truth remained, unspoken yet undeniable, that sometimes the loudest lessons are not delivered through force or noise, but through a moment so clear, so precise, that it leaves no room for misunderstanding, only reflection. The days that followed did not announce themselves as different, but something beneath the surface had undeniably changed, subtle yet steady, like a shift in gravity that no one could see but everyone could feel. And as students moved through Jefferson High's hallways, laughing, rushing to class, living out the ordinary rhythm of school life, there remained a quiet awareness that had not been there before, a collective memory of a moment that had redefined something fundamental without ever needing to explain itself. Emily continued her routine as she always had, arriving on time, sitting in the same seat near the back, taking notes with quiet focus, her presence unchanged in every visible way. And yet, the space around her carried a different energy now, not attention in the loud, performative sense, but recognition, the kind that does not demand acknowledgement yet cannot be ignored. A student who once would have brushed past her without a second thought now paused just slightly, offering a small nod, a gesture so simple it might have gone unnoticed, but it reflected something deeper, an adjustment in perception, an unspoken understanding that had taken root. In class, When discussions unfolded, Emily still spoke only when necessary, her voice calm and measured, but when she did, the room listened in a way it had not before, not because she sought authority, but because she had demonstrated something that could not be dismissed, something that lingered beyond that single moment in the hallway. Jason, on the other hand, moved through the same environment with a different awareness, one that he could not easily shake. And though he tried at first to return to his usual patterns, to reclaim the version of himself that had once felt automatic, the reactions around him no longer aligned in the same way. The laughter came slower, the attention less certain, and even when no one spoke about what had happened, it existed in the quiet spaces between interactions, shaping them in ways that did not require acknowledgement. One afternoon, as he stood by his locker again, the same place where everything had shifted, he found himself pausing, his hand resting against the cool metal as his thoughts returned, not to the words he had said, not to the attention he had sought, but to the moment he had lost control, the moment he realized that confidence without understanding was fragile, and that underestimating someone does not make them smaller. It only reveals how limited your own perspective can be. Down the hall, Emily passed by as she always did, her steps steady, her expression unchanged, and for a brief second, their paths aligned once more. But this time there was no tension, no challenge, just a quiet acknowledgement that needed no words, and Jason, for the first time, stepped slightly aside, not dramatically, not for show, just enough to create space, a small action that spoke louder than anything he could have said, because it came not from pressure, but from understanding. The hallway continued on, students passing, voices blending into the familiar hum of daily life. But that small shift, that single step, marked something deeper, a recognition that respect is not something you take. It is something you learn, often in moments you never expect, moments that do not rely on force or volume, but on clarity so undeniable it leaves no room for doubt. And as Emily walked forward without looking back, blending once again into the quiet rhythm of her own world, the lesson remained behind her, not spoken, not repeated, but understood by those who needed to see it, that the true measure of strength is not how loudly you can dominate a moment, but how effortlessly you can end one without ever raising your voice. And that day, in a hallway filled with noise and assumptions, the world paused just long enough to remember what dignity truly looks like.